Let's get to airlines in particular, and the numbers that they've been reporting and have yet to report. It's been a mixed picture for the industry this year, despite raised forecasts from the likes of Delta and American Airlines and soaring earnings as travel demand remains strong. There are still cost concerns and looming pilot shortages still lingering. For more on the state of the industry, we're joined by Helane Becker, TD Cowen Senior Research Analyst. Helane, it's always good to see you. We've heard from most of them. We still have JetBlue to report tomorrow. But kind of give us a state of play of where we are, given what we've heard so far.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think what we're seeing in terms of demand is still very, very strong demand, but pricing has come off their peaks. And I guess it was just not sustainable that ticket prices would stay as robust as they were, number one. And number two, I think you're seeing a shift as well. We've talked about demand being strong domestically for 2021 and 2022, and then shifting internationally for 23 and 24. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing very strong North Atlantic demand in Europe. And I'm going to say air quotes around everybody seems to be in Italy this summer. And then next summer, we think we'll see strong demand on the Trans-Pacific for all markets except for probably China.
And so, Helane, with that kind of international travel focus that you were just alluding to a moment ago, who are the biggest beneficiaries from your coverage and perspective?
Yeah, exactly. That's why American, Delta, and United have done really well this year, because they have the most exposure, and United specifically is more exposed to international markets than any of the other airlines. JetBlue has a couple of flights, one to Paris, one to London, and I think they're in Amsterdam next month. And then and that's it. Some of the other smaller U.S. airlines like Frontier and Spirit fly near U.S. markets, so they'll do Caribbean, Mexico, Northern, South America. But that demand was part of last year's strength. This year's strength is really on the North Atlantic, and most airlines, with the exception actually of United, got rid of all their wide-body or a lot of their wide-body aircraft during the pandemic. And now with the demand shifting, they're having a hard time keeping up because they don't have the aircraft to put into service. And that's why you've seen American and Delta come out with some aircraft orders. And the other thing that we've seen in terms of demand for aircraft, a shift to leased in aircraft or buying aircraft off from the lessors, primarily because the OEMs are still lagging on deliveries.
Even with the strong demand environment, it seems like some of the travel headaches are still looming large. You ask passengers, and I mean, you're nodding in concert with perhaps a lot of the emotions and feelings of some of our viewers right now. How does that kind of add on a knock-on effect to some of the airlines right now that are either bringing capacity, continuing to bring that back online, or have code sharing agreements where they're sending passengers through some of the rigmarole of just how, if they miss their flights, where they need to rebook, who gets the credit, so forth? What type of knock on the stock does that eventually create, if any?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. So it's just so frustrating for passengers, right? You plan all year long for your vacation, you're looking forward to it, and then something goes wrong the day that you travel. And it's not always the fault of the airline. Sometimes it's weather that creeps in, especially summer storms. Those are so unpredictable versus, like, we've talked about this before, Brad, you and I, the winter storms are almost always predictable. You know when you're going to get a big snowstorm, but with summer pop-up thunderstorms, you don't. And then there are downstream delays, to your point, and then passengers get frustrated. And I think the eventual effect will be, well, we sort of did that. I'm tired of all my flights being delayed or many flights being delayed. I'm just not going to take a trip that month or that week. I'm going to try to find a day of the week, like Tuesday, Wednesday, that might be less busy. And that does definitely impact results at some point. It's just right now, everybody, again, those air quotes, wants to travel. And until schools start to resume, and in some cases, especially southern tier of the US, they'll start to resume next week and the week after, you'll still see strong travel out of the Northeast. And we don't, that's not going to stop because those bookings are already made. But we've seen airports start to hire more people in an effort to help during the busiest times. And yeah, it just gets really frustrating. I get it. And, I always say to people, welcome to my life. I feel like for every that's on time or early, I'm going to pay for it with a late or canceled flight at some point in my future.
Well, it's funny, Helane, because as the airlines try to manage through it, just as an example, my son was flying this weekend. We got a message from the airline the night before. You might want to think about pushing your trip because there are thunderstorms forecast for the next day. Guess what? No thunderstorms, totally clear. The flight left on time. So I'd be pretty upset if I changed my flight with the anticipation that they, so it really does seem like a no-win situation, but it also seems like a situation that technology and more staffing could at least help. So that implies that the airlines are going to have to sort of spend more to address this, especially if the demand remains even close to the fever pitch where it's been.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And the demand that we're seeing also is pretty equal to what we saw in 2019. And but the mix is different. It's more leisure and it's less business. And I think one difference is that people who are infrequent travelers get more stressed out than people who are frequent travelers and know that this type of thing happens quote unquote, all the time. But the other thing, to your point, one of the things that technology could do for the airlines is enable connecting passengers to change the connecting hub. So if you're coming from mid-con, and let's say you're coming out of St. Louis and you're going to London, and your first choice was to connect over New York, if New York is going to have thunderstorms, maybe Boston doesn't, or Chicago doesn't. Maybe those storms have passed through. From the airline's perspective, they should be able to reroute you over a different hub. And their technology should enable either you to do that on their website or your iPhone or your smart device, or they can do it for you so that you don't miss a day of your vacation. Because to your point, just because there are forecast thunderstorms in my town, there may not be in yours. So they should be able to, with technology, make those adjustments. And that's something that I find interesting because the industry was an early adopter of technology and using computers to issue boarding passes and check bags and so on. And then through the bankruptcies that they all experienced in the last or 2 decades ago, they lagged on updating their technology, and I think they're starting to think about catching up now.
Helane, just while we have you, we asked the CFO of Chipotle last week, and follow me on this one. We asked the CFO of Chipotle last week how global warming could impact how they think about their business. And that was with regard to kind of sourcing the necessary menu items. For airlines and the travel experience, I mean, you just talked about storms and more severe weather that they have to account for and communicate that to their passengers. And their passengers may eventually shift some of the travel schedules around unknown parts of the year where there could be extreme weather that derails their trip plans. Is there a broader kind of concern, or at least a thought or evaluation that these companies are starting to give around global warming and how that changes what the customer propensity is to travel at certain times of the year?
Yeah, that's a really great question because it's something that we've been looking at for the last year or so. And it's slightly different, well, in 2 different ways. One, exactly what you're saying. Markets like Seattle, for an example, that historically wouldn't have snow. It would have rain, but it wouldn't be so overwhelming rain that it would shut the airport down for an extended period of time. And yet last winter, you saw Seattle experience snow and ice. So you're definitely seeing that weather pattern shift that's causing airports that haven't had to deal with de-icing or runway clearing to have to start thinking about their investments in de-icing pads, de-icing fluid, and so on. So that's definitely one thing that we are paying attention to, and I think the airlines and the airports are starting to think about. We're seeing that at various conferences that's being added as a discussion item. So, yes to that part. And then the other part that I would say is with respect to sustainable aviation fuel. Every airline has some commitment with a producer of SAF to provide that to them over the next, say, decade, because a lot of those orders go out that far. And the government, through the Inflation Reduction Act, is incentivizing manufacturers, the energy manufacturers, to produce more SAF. And that's really the problem. Airlines are only 2% of emissions, but the longest flights are 80% of the total emissions. So
Wow.
it's not really a like road transport is still the number one emissions. But that said, airlines are an easy target, and we need more sustainable aviation fuel. Every airline has said we're there to buy it if you make it.
Right.
And you just have to do it in a cost-effective manner. The industry worldwide, Brad, to give you an idea of the numbers, uses 100 billion gallons of jet fuel annually. And the amount of sustainable aviation fuel that's out there right now is less than 5%. I don't even think it's 1%. So it's not even like it's in the ballpark of what's needed. And that's I say that's a 2025 to 2040 development. That's where you're going to see the industry go over the next 15 years.
Helane, always a fascinating conversation. Thanks so much for taking the time to really break down what you're tracking over at TD Cowen. TD Cowen Senior Research Analyst Helane Becker joining us this morning. Thanks so much.
Thank you.